Born in Hertfordshire to Belgian parents, Gary grew up in Stevenage, studied French and Russian at Heriot-Watt University and newspaper journalism at City University. After 9 years of reporting for The Guardian from all over Europe, Africa, the US and the Caribbean, Gary was appointed The Guardian's US correspondent in 2003, where he spent 12 years before returning to London with his wife and 2 children in 2015. Another Day in the Death of America, his latest book, has won multiple awards, including the Aronson Outstanding Achievement Award for Social Justice Journalism by the City University of New York, and most recently, it's been nominated for Hurston White Legacy Award. So I think we should give a huge round of applause to Gary. As a foreigner, reporting from this vast and stunning country over more than a decade felt like anthropology. I saw it as my mission less to judge the United States than try to understand it. Can you explain what you meant by that? And now that Trump is in power, is that still an easy position to hold?
It's easy to judge, and actually part of my job as a columnist is to judge. But when you're reporting from somewhere, and I've seen this actually a lot in Britain in recent times, the challenge is to really understand it, is to kind of think, well, why do people do that? Why do people think that? Why do people want that? So why, and the things that are hardest to understand are the things that where you have to make the longest journey, and they're often the most important journeys to make. So trying to approach people who wanted to vote for Donald Trump with some generosity, a generosity of spirit that says, okay, I'm assuming you're a rational person, I'm assuming you are voting in your interests, I'm wondering what those interests are, I'm wondering why you would do that, and staying open to their answers enough that you might convey them. Because otherwise everything's always a surprise. I mean, this was my main criticism about the way that some journalists reported this election. It wasn't that they didn't support Corbyn. I don't really care about that. Our job is not really to support one person or one party or another. It's not that they got the result wrong, because our job is not to predict results. It's that they weren't open to what was going on, that they weren't curious. And to me, that's the greatest crime journalistically, is not to be curious. And so when I went around America, I was constantly trying to think, okay, so you're a working class person in precarious standards, living standards. Why would you not want healthcare? Explain it to me so that I can understand, so that I can tell people. The easiest stuff to do is to talk to people that you agree with, who will tell you what you kind of, or more or less know already. And there's a place for that, but it's a big country, it's an important country, and either something like Trump winning is going to just leave us all in a state of absolute shock and horror, and it can do that too. But actually, even politically, you're much better positioned to confront and defeat something if you understand it. And my job is to help people understand, not to have them, when I'm reporting, not to have them agree with me.
Another Day in the Death of America is a compelling, harrowing, depressing, but also liberating book, as it gives voice to 10 children and young people who would have remained faceless statistics. Why this book? Why do you feel so compelled to write it?
The notion of this book, every day in America on average, 7 kids are shot dead every day. That's 19 or under. And in 2007, I was given the task for the Guardian magazine of doing basically this. And there was one story in particular that just blew me away. And it was a kid in Detroit called Brandon Marcel Moore. But he wasn't named in the papers. In the papers, Detroit had 2 papers, and in both of them, he just got a paragraph that said a boy was shot by a security guard outside of a store. So it took me a long time to find out even who this boy's name was. And then I found his family, and then I found out what happened. And it was truly shocking that Brandon, who I think he was 15, had gone into a store with his cousins and his uncle. The store had a policy that kids could not go in unaccompanied. They had to be with an adult. They were with an adult, but as happens, anyone who's, knows teenage kids, they all go in together. The kids want to look at the video games. The adult goes and gets what they've gone in for. So that's what happened. The security guard then tried to shoo them out, and they had an argument. And as he was ushering them out, there was a tussle. Brandon wasn't involved in it. It was his cousins and his older brother. And the security guard's gun fell out of his pocket. At which point the kid started running. And the security guard, this is how Brandon's brother tells it, got on one knee and just started shooting. And he shot Brandon in the back and he killed him. That's bad enough. I think that would make the papers. Then it turns out the security guard was actually an off-duty cop. Then it turns out that that off-duty cop had killed someone while drink driving and had been allowed back on the force. Then it turns out that he'd also shot his wife, but not killed her. Then it turned out that he'd also shot a neighbor and killed him in a dispute, in the street, and he'd been exonerated. And that didn't make the paper. And so then this is a day I'd chosen at random in 2006, I think. I did the piece in 2007. And then that there are lots of other stories out there that you also don't know, and that your job as a journalist is to excavate, is to tell people things they don't know, to show the world in a light that they wouldn't previously understand. And that with a lot of these deaths, there was this fatal flaw in journalism, which is this adage, well, dog bites man is not a story, man bites dog is a story. And actually, sooner or later, you have to ask yourselves, well, who owns these dogs? And why do they keep buying these people? Why do the same people keep getting bitten? And what can we do to get these dogs under control? And so what is banal, is also morally unacceptable. This is what we're seeing with Grenfell, I think, with Grenfell Towers. Had that tower block not gone up in flames, the institutional neglect would have been allowed to continue for years and years. And so I had always wanted to do this as a book. And I didn't actually know, and then a chance came, somebody came up with the money to do it, because it costs a lot to do it, because you have to travel around the country. And I didn't realize at the time when I started it, how much I needed to do it. That I already knew I was leaving. And this felt like it tied together an awful lot of what I'd been dealing with over the previous 12 years, but hadn't found a place to put. Because it is a story about 10 kids who got shot dead in one day. It's also a story about American youth, and about the inequalities and inequities of everyday life for working class people in America. And there's a range of ways in which I touched on those things in articles, but I've never really found a vehicle to pursue them in a way that I could in this book.
Something just popped into my head, because the fact that you said that you started writing it because you knew you were leaving and you got the commission, how much did being a father of a young black boy play into that as well?
Not so much, in terms of the need to write it. I mean, you can't, I have a son and a daughter, and you can't escape. When I wrote about America being like anthropology, the kind of next bit I wrote was that, but as time went on and I had kids, there was less distance, because I had skin in the game, and it was black skin in a game that was not, where the rules were not even. And so that way in which, say, I must have been there about 6 months, and I was reporting from Mississippi, and I stopped to ask for directions. I know enough not to step on people's property in Mississippi, I know that. But I stood away, and I said, "Excuse me, I'm looking for Rock Cut Road," and the response came, "We got a gun, we got a gun." And I thought, okay. So I'm looking for Rock Cut Road, you know, "We gonna shoot you, we got a gun." And then they actually ran to get their gun. And luckily this was all on radio. I was doing this radio program about the Mississippi burning case. And I was like, "They've got a fucking gun, we gotta go." And we jump in the car and we drive off. And just up that road, I think about 3 or 4 days later, a journalist, a white journalist, had his arm broken by someone. And when I went home from that trip, and I told my wife and her brother, and my wife and my brother-in-law, both African American, and I was telling it like this funny thing happened, you wouldn't believe it, and they didn't laugh at all. And they were just like, "You're an idiot." And I said, "Well, how?" They said, "You don't walk around Mississippi asking white people directions in rural Mississippi." And I was like, "In the middle of the day, when you're not on their property?" And they were like, No. And they didn't think it was funny at all. And sometimes they do think why I say it's funny. So it wasn't just me not being funny. And that was the anthropology. That was the, like, you know. And so having kids, then when you're reading about these kids and you think, well, that could be my kid. That could be my kid because my kid is silly like that or funny like that. Or it gives you another place to go with their stories. When I was talking, the youngest boy to die that day was 9. My son would have been 8 when I filed the book. And when I'm interviewing his friends, I can talk about the games that they're playing. Well, so were you Octopus Prime or were you this? You know, I knew I was fluent in what 9-year-olds do, you know, Minecraft, all that kind of stuff. There'd been a shootout near my son's daycare in Chicago. The spring came and a gun was washed up out of the ice near his school, another one near his park. So there was no way of avoiding that these issues were in your life. But it wasn't what made me, it wasn't what drove me.
Read from Another Day in the Death of America.
So this is from the end. And at about 3 o'clock, a boy in North Carolina was shot dead at 3 o'clock in the morning. And he's the last one, Justin Hinnett, in the book. And so this is, so that was early hours of Sunday morning, 24th of November. At 11:15 on Sunday, the 24th of November, Cleveland police rushed to the 5500 block of Linton Avenue, where they found 16-year-old Darnell Jones shot in the neck. Paramedics took him to the Metro Health Medical Center, where he later died. There was no profile of who he was or wanted to be, no interviews with his parents. Beyond official records, there was no further evidence that he was ever on the planet. And so it goes on. Another 24 hours and the first of yet another slew of slain children whose stories will not be told and whose passing will provoke no outrage. Researching and writing this book has made me want to scream. I wanted to scream at Edwin and Dylan that guns are not toys. At Jerry to either take the kids or stay home. At Stanley to quit hanging on the corner. At Justin to watch who he hangs out with. And at T-Sean's mother to move. I wanted to scream at journalists and police to treat these deaths as though their lives mattered. But more than it's made me want to scream at anyone in particular, it's mostly made me want to just howl at the moon. A long, doleful, piercing cry for a wealthy country that could and should do better for its youth and children, for my children, but appears to have settled, legislatively at least, on a pain threshold that is morally unacceptable. I want to bay towards the heavens because while kids like those featured in this book keep dying, the political class refuses not only to do everything in its power, but anything at all to minimise the risks for the kids who will be shot dead today or tomorrow. It's as though each death took place in helpless, hopeless isolation. A private, discreet tragedy complete unto itself. The broader context of race and poverty was clear to many, but when I told them of other families that had lost children that day, all seemed genuinely shocked that their grief overlapped in real time with that of others. It's as though they'd lost a loved one in a war without any clear purpose, end or enemy. A war they could do nothing about. A war they long knew existed but hoped by luck, judgment, discipline and foresight that they might be able to protect their kids from. A war that is generally acknowledged in the abstract but rarely specifically addressed in the concrete. A war that took their children but offered them no allies or community in their grief. A war they knew was taking place elsewhere but experienced alone, as though it were happening only to them, when in fact it was happening to America every day. The thing that gives me comfort about reading that passage is I still feel the same way about it. That people want you to come up with some kind of solution, to tie it all neatly together to make it work, and it doesn't work. And it's not that reading a book only makes me want to scream, but mostly makes me want to scream, and that there are, and this is what is so haunting about the statistic, is that with almost every case in this book, you could say, oh, if only you hadn't done that. Stanley, just stop hanging around the corner. If Jaden hadn't answered the door, then they wouldn't be in the book. But the statistic tells you then someone else would have been in the book, that someone else didn't answer the door that day, someone else didn't hang on the corner that day. And there is a certainty about that statistic that means that on the morning of that day, I could sit down, and I'm describing it in its most morbid terms for effect, I could sit down and wait for children to die.
But that level of uncertainty with each story must have enveloped you while writing it and researching it. How did you personally navigate that?
The first two to be shot, they're not the first two to die because Jaden's kept alive so that his organs can be harvested. Jaden's 9, there's a knock at the door. They assume it's in the morning. It's actually the 50th anniversary of Kennedy's assassination. They assume it's two girls from down the road who will sometimes come by to get sugar or to ask for a lift. The rule in the house for Jaden, because his brothers were older, is if you're all the way ready, socks, shoes, if you're ready, then you can do what you want, which was usually play Minecraft or watch Cars for like 50th time. So Jaden's ready, there's a knock at the door, Jaden jumps up to answer the door, and he crouches behind the door as though to jump out and say boo. And so he's behind the door and he can't be seen, and nobody walks in, so then he just pokes his head around the door and he's shot dead by his mum's ex-lover and the father of Jaden's eldest brother. And it's as horrific a story as you can imagine. One of Jaden's family friends said, he was like 17, said, every day I put myself in more danger than Jaden ever did in his whole life. And the challenge with this book was getting testimony, getting people to talk, to make these kids, to bring them to life, to find out who they were, because they don't get much coverage. And quite often there was a lot of luck. And in this case, I had the address where he was shot. I sent a letter to that address. It just so happened they'd moved, but they'd stayed in town, and it just so happened that the people who lived there met one of the sons and said, "Oh, we got this letter," and passed it to the mum, and then the mum wanted to speak to me. And for the most part, what you found is that these kids had been killed, nothing had been said, and so the opportunity to talk was gratefully taken. That and I would write to them and I would say, I know how your son died. They were all boys on this day. I would like to know how they lived, who they were, what made them laugh, what made you angry about them, what you were proud about. And so I reached his mum, and I interviewed her twice, and we're still in contact actually. And the challenge was the testimony, and for the 10 kids I reached 8 kin. But Kenneth Mills Tucker, I found his family by going, it's a lot of kind of like detective-y, shoe leathery work. So I looked through his online obituary, got the names of his grandparents. I think they're the most likely to have a landline. So then America is very reliably segregated. So then I took their name, put it in the white pages, looked for people with that name in black areas, and I got it first time. Originally, the woman of the house said the man in the house wasn't in, but then that turned out she thought I was a debt collector. So then she called him and we chatted, and he gave me his son's number, so that would be Kenneth's dad. And I did walk around the block before I did this because I preferred not to cold call people. I preferred to put a letter in the box or something. But I felt, well, I've got his number, I've got to call him. So I called him and I completely blindsided him. Who are you? How did you get my number? I said, your grandfather gave it to me. Your father gave it to me. How did you get his number? He just couldn't see past it. He didn't want to talk to me. He said he would. He said he'd call me back. He never did. In retrospect, what I wish I'd done was texted him, because that would give him time to process it. But there were moments throughout. First of all, that was the first rejection I got, and it threw me. And I had to calculate, and I had this conversation with my editor. How many people can we not get before we don't have a book? You can't just do a whole book on people's Twitter feeds and Facebook pages and police records and so on. I mean, that was one of the more stunning things for me in doing it, were these scripts that get played out. So, almost anyone that you would ask, what do you think's going on here? They don't talk about guns. Not a single person, when I ask an open-ended question, what do you think is going on here? Nobody mentions guns. So I think Americans can no more imagine a world without guns than a world without traffic. If your kid gets run over, you don't think we have to get rid of traffic completely, even though that wouldn't necessarily be a bad idea, but people don't think that. Maybe a stop sign, maybe a speed bump. And so they moved to parenting, and there are these things people say, babies having babies, kids don't, it's not like it was in my day. And then you look at the stats and you realize actually teenage pregnancy is going down, that most of the parents who were saying this, actually in their day there was a crack epidemic and it was much worse. And you realize that in the absence of other scripts, people will say what's out there. They will pick from the things that are out there. And this kind of, well, there are two things. So first of all, there is a limited, given the things that you see around you, the sense of limited options that people have. So the mother in Tishon Anderson in Chicago is killed in a stairwell, and a woman in the block is interviewed. And she says, that's why I'm glad my 14-year-old is in jail, because they can't kill him there. It's a devastating thing for anyone to say. But then you realize how much you do it yourself. And this came to me with, I found out in the process of research that the one research I've done into parenting have found that black fathers in America were more likely to read to their children, bathe their children, eat with their children, help their children with their homework, and so on, than any other ethnic group. Less likely than any other ethnic group to live with a partner, more likely than any other ethnic group to do that. And I thought, that can't be true. So I checked it, and I double checked it, and I kind of looked for references to it to see. And then I thought, hang on, I'm a black father, and I do all of those things. And somehow, I have come to believe that this couldn't be true. And this was a lie that I was actually believing against myself. And, you know, I say that because otherwise it sounds like that all of those dopes are hoodwinked. We're all hoodwinked. We all work on the basis of the scripts that are available. And one of the challenges, I think, as a journalist, and in a way what you're doing with this, with Words of Colour, is creating new scripts for people. But there's a different way of understanding your past, your present, your future, your country, yourself. But they don't come out of the clear blue sky. Those scripts have to be written and amplified.
I want to ask you then, bear in mind all of what you said, about whether or not you see your role as a journalist and a writer and a commentator as a career or a mission. So I do wonder, if you weren't here, or you weren't doing this, and all the effort you put into this book, where on earth would we know about those stories? You know, but I just think, you know, in terms of, you mentioned that in the foreword in your book about anthropology and mission, but I'm curious how, because I mean, you write prodigiously, you editor at large, you write your books, you write in-depth pieces, not just for Guardian, but for other publications. You're a father. It feels more than just a career to me.
So, I mean, I get paid well for what I do. So,
I hope so.
so to that extent, you know, there are people who are doing great work and not being paid at all, or certainly not enough. And so, you know, there is that. I wouldn't want to kind of, you know, overdo it. Without wanting to get on the couch too much, my mother died when I was 19, and she died very suddenly. And it taught me a few things at a very early age. I'd rather she was alive, but since she died, and it was not in my gift to keep her alive, I'm glad I learned these lessons. And one is, she died suddenly. One is, our life here is short. We don't know when it's going to end. So you got to do what you got to do. And if there's a mission that I think we should all have, is that we try and leave the planet in a better state than we found it. And I think whatever you do, if you're driving buses, if you're teaching, if you're selling books, it doesn't matter what you're doing as a living, there are ways in which we can all do that. And I definitely feel a responsibility beyond my job. And it's not a career insofar as, even when I was starting out, there are places I wouldn't work. There are newspapers I would not contribute to. And, you know, I've written for Hello magazine, so there's a lot of things I would contribute to. But there are, I like a lot of people here, and like you and the work that you do, I feel that a good life has some purpose in it. It just so happens that the career I've chosen is one where you amplify kind of your point of view, but, you know, there are people out there stitching up kids who've been stabbed, or doing pastoral work with teens in hard to reach neighbourhoods, or giving up their weekends to contribute to their church and all of that kind of stuff. They're not getting paid, they're not getting the recognition, and so there is a significant amount of humility that has to come with the response to that question.
Gary, I just want to say thank you. Keep doing what you do so exceptionally well.